We got two different devices. As I mentioned to you, okay. Well, thank you for joining us. Today is July 5th, 2023. We're at the famous Concord School of Philosophy. I'm Andrew Williams Jr. As Stuart and Claire Weeks will introduce you to where we are and why we're here. Stuart, all of you report.
Thank you, dear brother. So friends, as noted, we are on the grounds of the Orchard House. Excuse the background noise. It's on a main road. And this is the home of Louisa May Alcott, who, as many people know, wrote Little Women. This is in Concord, Massachusetts. I'm a native son of Concord and founder of its Center for American Studies. I love to come to this spot and sit where I'm sitting now on this bench and watch pilgrims of all ages, mostly women of all ages, so they do bring along their men, who are pilgrims from all over the world, who come here to pay their respects to Louisa May and Little Women in the Alcott family. It is a true destination, and it's a remarkable story. So this is the Orchard House. Perhaps you can see the home of Mother Alcott and 4 little women. During the story of Little Women, father's off at war. And then if we turn to the left, here is the Concord School of Philosophy and in its day literature, both philosophy and literature. The Concord School of Philosophy and Literature was a fruit of the transcendentalist impulse that came to a remarkable blossoming in the Indian summer of transcendentalism towards the end. Thoreau had marched on to the beat of his own drummer, as had Nathaniel Hawthorne. Dame Margaret Fuller, who said, "I accept the universe," accepted her fate shipwrecked off Fire Island in New York. Emerson was old, Alcott was old. But in the Indian summer of transcendentalism, the fruit of this extraordinary impulse blossomed in this, what was called the Hillside Chapel. The Hillside Chapel. For 10 summers, the Concord School of Philosophy and Literature brought an extraordinary impulse to American culture. I would say it's one of the most significant chapters in our cultural history, where for a moment the mills of materialism that were grinding away, as they were along the Merrimack rivers in Lowell and Lawrence and in Manchester, New Hampshire, the mills of industrialism of an industrial age were grinding the human being into a number, into a head count. The humanity was lost. And the Concord School of Philosophy and Literature, in the spirit of Louisa May and Little Women, brought a remarkable impulse that was seeded over that decade. Emerson died. A summer was devoted, part of the summer session was devoted to tributes to the sage of Concord. And Amos Bronson Alcott also offered up his spirit. So the school closed with a memorial service to him. It's a very, very rich cultural history. But we're here tonight to go back even earlier in history. And in towns like Concord, you have history upon history, layer upon layer. At this very same location, at the end of the King Philip's War, which was one of the bloodiest wars in history, American history, which arose when the Pilgrims were followed by Puritans, shiploads and waves of Puritans, puritanical souls who were fleeing from tyranny in England to, in all too many cases, unfortunately, impose it here in New England, including the Salem witch trials and the like. Well, at the end of the King Philip's War, here where we're sitting on this location, this home was owned by a man named John Hoar, Hoar, from an old distinguished Concord family. And here he sought to safeguard the praying Indians at the conclusion of the King Philip's War. And who were the praying Indians? The praying Indians, the story goes, were native peoples who, before the boat people arrived, heard a song in the wind, the way the legend goes, a song in the wind before the boats arrived that caused them to pause and perk up their ears. In time, the boats did arise, and these weren't explorers or trappers or pirates. These were boats with mothers and children. These were families with cattle and livestock. They were fleeing the old world to find a home in the new world. And they were welcomed by the native peoples. It's not politically correct to say, but the best research I'm aware of from those who have done the diligence suggests that the first 54 years of contact between the native peoples and the Pilgrims, again, not yet the Puritans, the puritanical Puritans, but the Pilgrims, were blessed years with only one conflict, which wasn't that major, but a deep friendship, and that was forged by the fact that half of the passengers on the Mayflower had died. So there were tremendous losses, including William Bradford's wife, Dorothy. And the native peoples they met also had been reduced in their ranks significantly through warfare and disease. So these people that met were kin folks who shared loss. And it was, I believe, a providential connection between them. Not accidental, incidental, coincidental, but for that first contact period, it was providential. But then, as mentioned, the boatloads came. But in those early years, the story goes, the legend goes, that when the Pilgrims arrived and built their meeting house, one day a song was heard in the wind, but it wasn't coming in a ship approaching from overseas. It was among them. It was in that meeting house where their new Pilgrim friends were, and the native peoples were drawn to that song, and in time drawn to Christianity. Indeed, the first Bible, we're told, that was published in the New World was published for the native peoples in the Algonquin language, if my memory serves me correctly. The first Bible in these shores was published for the native peoples. And there we have a remarkable chapter in our history, because as the boat people, Pilgrims, Puritans, after the 54 years, expanded their ranks into the land that didn't have barbed wire fences and no trespassing, the land that belonged to Mother Earth and to the peoples, the tensions arose with the waves of Puritans, and that led finally to war, a cessation of peace to war. This was a challenge for the praying Indians because their providential role was as a boat people ended up, one might say, swapping their covenant with Christ for the covenant with manifest destiny that is conquering. Somebody had to safeguard the impulse of Christ, the Christ impulse, the heart of Christianity. And it lay to the praying Indians to do just that. That when the settlers of both people had lost contact with that impulse, with the Christ, the native Indians, the praying Indians, safeguarded it. And so we come to this location. not the Orchard House, not the home of Louise May Alcott, Little Women, but the home of John Hoare. And in this building, but it wasn't this building, another building, he had stockaded, sought to safeguard the praying Indians, who, when the war came, the King Philip's War, had to decide on what side they would fight. Those weren't days when you could be on the fence. They were red men and women. They were Indians. But they'd found something that for them transcended blood. They found something that had to do with Christ, with the I am, which is that which can redeem our blood-bound bonds for those who can imagine. And so they chose to fight on the side of the settlers here in Concord, the Concordians. They went against, one might say, their blood connections, and they chose to fight on behalf of the settlers. When the war was over, some of Concord's citizens who couldn't tell one red man or woman from another, so it seems, called a certain Colonel Mosley, a Rough Rider, to come in and round up the praying Indians and get rid of them. And so he came to this site where we are. And John Hoare tried to stand up for them, who had stood up and supported their allies in the war. But he was overwhelmed. And Colonel Mosley and his Rough Riders, at the behest of some of Concord's fearful citizens, marched the praying Indians, our allies, our brothers, who had safeguarded the Christ impulse, to their death, many, exposed to the elements, in the cold winter on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. And so, friends, that brings to the end this offering today. And I want to call particularly to mind the chief of the praying Indians, a dear sister and friend, a former friend, who offered up her spirit this last Palm Sunday, only a month or so ago. She bore much of the ills and pains of her people. She was in a wheelchair for the last years of her life, and cancer eventually got the best of her. But she was a noble soul, chief carrying hands of the praying Indians. And in fact, she's been nominated as one of the nominees for the Concord Noble Award for Peace. Thoreau said, "That is the uncommon school we want. Instead of noblemen, let us have noble villages of men and women." And that's what's behind the Concord Noble Award for Peace. More to be said at another time. But I wanted to end by honoring Carrying Hands, the chief of the praying Indians, on this location, on this day, as part of the Concord Congress, where we build the bridge from the Albany Congress of 1754 for Franklin and Jefferson, and the delegates to the Albany Congress from all the different colonies invited the Iroquois elders, who had a tremendous confederation, mighty confederation, honorable confederation, that they valued and wished to learn from, to come and counsel them on how the colonies could overcome their differences, which were pretty pronounced and confederate. So on this Concord Congress evening, we call to mind this chapter in the history of the native peoples of our land. We do that with great respect and reverence and appreciation. So I hand this back to my colleague, Andrew Williams Jr., who has journeyed with us through these sites and stages of our history. And thanks and gratitude.
Well, thank you so much, Stuart Sinclair Weeks. And we're going to bring this edition to close. We look forward